Welcome to EV Hub Live, a live video podcast for professionals advancing transportation electrification. To find out more about the show, visit atlasevhub.com/live. Can the U.S. maintain and expand its recent foothold in the critical minerals industry? On today's episode, we're joined by Abigail Hunter of the SAFE Center for Critical Minerals Strategy. We'll dive into the latest federal policy shifts, geopolitics, and the rapidly changing electric vehicle landscape to unpack how these forces are shaping America's battery and critical minerals supply chains. Here's your host, Atlas Public Policy founder, Nick Nigro.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to EV Hub Live. I'm your host, Nick Nigro, and I'm very excited to talk about critical minerals again. We covered this topic a little bit ago. If you're a frequent watcher of the show, you probably remember that one. A lot has changed since that time period. But I'm very excited to be joined by my guest, Abigail Hunter of SAFE. SAFE is a wonderful organization that's been around for over 20 years, longtime friend of Atlas, been to many great SAFE events over the years, and excited to have this conversation with Abigail, who, in my opinion, knows more about critical minerals really than anybody else in the policy space at the moment. So we're really grateful to have you join the show here.
Thanks so much, Nick. It's really great to be here and looking forward to what I'm sure will be a great conversation. Yeah,
indeed. Before we get into it, just want to give a shout out to my friend Avery Ash, who took over the CEO job of SAFE, filling some big shoes. Robbie Diamond has been running SAFE since it was founded more than 20 years ago, and he's passing on the reins to Avery. So looking forward to see what Avery's able to do with SAFE, and I'm sure he's going to be a great boss. So. Cool. So let's jump into it. If there's one thing that is carried over from, the Biden administration to the Trump administration, it's interest in critical minerals and batteries. The battery tax credit was the one big tax incentive that remained during the negotiations for the big, beautiful bill that was enacted this summer. In my opinion, it's the most important tax incentive for the clean economy. So we still have a lot of, policy in place that's going to help drive critical minerals and batteries. And the Trump administration is really trying to focus on critical minerals and materials. And so I'd love to hear, just to get us going, how do you feel like that's playing out in practice?
Yeah, I often look back to the Biden administration in comparison to the Trump administration, and I equate it to kind of a pyramid to visualize it. So at the top of the pyramid, driving critical minerals policy was the clean energy transition, as you rightfully noted, Nick, and embedded in several of those incentives and regulations. And then kind of the bottom pillars of the pyramid were economic security, U.S. job creation, and then national security, making sure that these supply chains for our defense and broader economy are as secure as possible. With the Trump administration, you kind of have flipped this pyramid upside down, and they are taking the national security concerns related to critical mineral supply chains at face value, which is great for an organization like SAFE, who's been advocating for those things for a really long time. That was, I would say, proven when we had some severe export controls from China earlier this year that affected both the clean economy and just broader industry, and has really led them down a path of taking a lot more direct interest and engagement with not only projects, but also specific countries that I know we'll go into.
Yeah. In particular, one of the things that you mentioned in terms of flipping this pyramid, they've also kind of redefined what we are considering to be quote unquote critical minerals, expanding that definition. I know that got some, people's eyebrows raised on some of these, but I'd love to understand, what's the actual practical impact of this? And for folks who aren't following it closely, they added metallurgical coal, copper, and uranium to the list of critical minerals. Is this something that's going to help the industry? Is it going to have little to no effect? Tell us more about what the impact is of that.
Yeah, first, I think it's important to ground ourselves in there are 3 distinct critical minerals lists within the U.S. government ecosystem that drive policy and investment and public sector investment. One of them is the Defense Logistics Agency list that is really based on kind of stress testing our defense industrial base and broader economy needs in times of crisis. And then the other is the U.S. Geological Survey list, which really takes its methodology takes into consideration the national and economic security impacts of a mineral, and especially if that mineral is subject to any vulnerabilities in its supply chain. And then you have the DOE critical materials list, fun stuff to have to equivocate over, like the difference of a word that's often considered a synonym. But that list is also strongly based on the USGS methodology, but really focuses on ultimately the energy impacts of those supply chains. The Biden administration really focused in doing the first of those lists on a lot of the clean energy technologies and their mineral intensity. The Trump administration broadened that a little bit in trying to consider broader mineral intensity of traditional energy sources in addition to these new energy sources. That's, I think, the motive for having a met coal on there. The other thing I would just emphasize too is that SAFE has long emphasized that we need to have a little bit more of a forward-looking nature when it comes to evaluating supply chain vulnerabilities and getting these minerals on these lists. And so we are pleased to see some of those considerations embedded in the USGS methodology, which in part has prompted the inclusion of things like copper onto the list. And then the last uranium in the Energy Act of 2020 that ultimately gave us these lists. They specifically said non-fuel sources. And so the inclusion of uranium was an additional inclusion by the Secretary of Interior, who has the right to do so. And it's particularly focused on its non-fuel sources, which do have big impacts on our broader economy. So still important to consider. It's forced me to kind of broaden my consideration in the mineral space. I used to have 50 children. Now I have like 60 children. Most important to maybe look out for is the methodology and how they've been adjusting that.
Help us understand some of the practical implications of this. Like, you've got a list. What that means? That mean funding gets open for it? Does that mean, they're subject to certain regulations now, or subject to fewer regulations? Like, help the uneducated get smart on your children here.
Yeah, it's not a perfect, I would say, one for one in terms of if you're on this list, it means you get faster permitting. If you're on this list, you get different incentives. Specifically for the USGS list, that is the list that the agency formerly known as the Loan Programs Office, now the Energy Dominance Funding Office, EDFO, is supposed to be using in their rulemaking for funding different projects. They had a mandate reshift under OBBB, so maybe that's a little bit different, but that was previously where we saw the USGS list used. We also have the 45X materials list. So those are specific purity levels, and they're actually written out in law and need to be adjusted directly in law, like we saw with met coal's inclusion of that. And so it's based off of the USGS list, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those incentives get changed, unfortunately, for people who are producing a lot of high purity copper for different purposes. So it's not like something I can kind of map out. It's more like a spaghetti chart of like, okay, if you're on this list, maybe you get this. And if you're on this list, this is the adjustment that would need to be made to get this. But ultimately, it does drive a lot of investor attention, and it does get used by Hill staffers frequently as in defining critical minerals in this bill. We're using this list in definition.
Yeah. If for me, what I'm hearing is basically, it's going to potentially impact the priorities of how certain government agencies execute on their programs. Might not have a total, clear impact to the everyday person outside of it, but it certainly could impact how money is being allocated, I would think. Is that right?
Yeah. And I mean, there is an incredible amount of attention from like the miners themselves, the producers of these minerals on these lists. My last job, I was working for the Quebec government, and a lot of junior miners operating in Quebec would refer to the minerals commodity summaries out of USGS and the minerals list as kind of their Bible for the year, and wanting to get on there and acknowledged as a way to kind of show investors and purchasers of the importance of their commodity. So there is a little bit of interesting maneuvering happening behind the scenes here because of the way it captures attention in certain circles.
So I just have to ask one more follow-up, because this is really interesting to me, and it's copper. Copper is plentiful. It's everywhere. It's in the pipes. It's in electronics. Why is that a critical mineral, and why would it be added to the list now?
So again, the way that USGS defines it is if it does have a direct impact on our economic security and national security, which you just described, it does have a big impact, obviously, in our day-to-day lives. A lot what we're, tuning in on is enabled by copper, right? And a lot of the data centers of the future, whether it's the wiring or if it's the transmission lines powering them, are very much copper enabled. In terms of kind of whether or not it should get this vulnerability designation, the IEA has found that while we're looking in pretty good shape for certain minerals in terms of new projects coming online, copper is one of these minerals that we are expected to have scarcity by 2035 of around 30%. And so this is where the forward-looking aspect of this comes into play. We definitely are going to need more copper, not less, as the rest of the world electrifies, digitizes, and we do see more of that in our economies. And so it's important to kind of take that forward-looking perspective and including it in the list. And hopefully that results in further action on copper production globally.
I think the scarcity status might come as a surprise to a lot of everyday people, or even people who work in EV policy, honestly, just given where, how prevalent copper is in our lives. So I can see why they wanted to make it onto these lists. Super helpful. So we're talking about critical minerals here. One of the things that the Trump administration is really focused on in the immediate first year of being in office here is on international relationships as it relates to critical minerals. There have been bilateral agreements with Australia, Malaysia, Thailand, Japan, and most recently the DRC, Congo, and Rwanda, which was tied to a peace agreement. And this is a potential pretty bright spot, I think, for the U.S. government right now in forming these partnerships and potentially opening up new markets for U.S. businesses or streamlining opportunities to import or process critical minerals in different countries. I'm wondering if you could talk more about this and how important it is to either just the U.S. economy, the U.S. government relations, or even domestic investment.
Yeah, great question. So I would maybe, before digging into specifics, emphasize two high-level trends that I think people should appreciate in contemplating the administration's approach to these international partnerships. One is that the partnerships really do meet the jurisdictions where they are. One of the things that you become quickly aware of in the mineral space is that risk is not the same for one commodity dependent on the market that project is taking place in. You have very different above ground risk, geopolitical risk, political risk within that jurisdiction that need to be taken into consideration as you support projects and try to increase the flow of materials and the diversification of these supply chains. So they are meeting those jurisdictions where they are, and they are trying to take a country-specific approach in driving this. The other trend that is worth emphasizing is that the administration is definitely bringing, core aspects of U.S. foreign policy, like engaging on security and peace. They're bringing that into the fold, but in a way where we are actually seeing them focus a little bit more on getting something for the United States in return of that, but also try to bring in the private sector so it's, economic benefit for security or peace. And that is very much shining through in the Rwanda, DRC peace agreement and minerals agreement. And I'm less involved in the peace side of the agreement. I'm sure experts can kind of speak about the staying power and engagement that the administration with those governments and other foreign partners have had. But in terms of our engagement, we convened a roundtable with the DRC, Rwanda, and the US government and private sector players in August of this year. And multiple people who have been living and breathing the sub-Saharan Africa peace space for a long time, former ambassadors, deputy assistant secretaries from administrations past, came up to me and said this economic aspect, this kind of minerals for security aspect, has been missing and seems to be a really strong motivator for these governments to not only engage in these conversations, but engage in the same conversation where maybe they wouldn't have been as comfortable operating in the same room previously. So that's quite positive. There's a lot of really unique aspects to the DRC US deal that we can dig into, but I'll stop there on kind of the high level aspects.
Yeah. I mean, you made me think of a lot of follow-up questions. First being, helping, the EV policy audience, our audience better understand how important this is to the supply chain of the clean economy, particularly in the case of batteries and electric vehicles. Help us understand why these agreements are going to make it easier for companies to, make batteries, process critical minerals, do all the things it takes to actually get an EV into the marketplace. Are these agreements essentially required for this to happen, or were there alternatives?
I don't know if they're necessarily required, because you can have B2B engagements that are driving change in these supply chains, right? But I
Hmm.
think the important thing here, one of the major issues we contend with in the mineral space is overproduction and concentration of that production, not
Hmm.
necessarily just geographically, but also like market concentration, where like one country, China, has outsized monopsony and monopoly power as a major producer and purchaser of these materials. And that means that if we don't engage in these conversations, we know who's going to be buying this up and kind of enabling their downstream industry's competitiveness with or without us. So we had a couple of OEMs in the room for these specific roundtables I mentioned. And I think the important thing they tried to impress upon the foreign governments and the US government is that, absent of US engagement doesn't mean this production doesn't happen with oversupply and adverse effects on the market. And it also doesn't guarantee that we, the US, the West, are going to be able to access these materials. And so we do need to engage. The other aspect of this that's maybe less related to security and more to governance and social acceptability of these processes is we have the ability to kind of drive capacitization, transparency, and traceability into these types of agreements so that there's
Hmm.
limited reputational risk for these companies who need these materials for batteries, but then there's also widespread kind of broader industrial applications.
Yeah, I want to, dig into that a little bit more because, I can imagine there being reasonable amount of hesitancy for some U.S. companies standing up operations in some of these places in the world, particularly those that are most vulnerable to conflict. And I wonder if the agreements where the U.S. government is a part of them, there's effectively a bit of dependency on success. Our government's attached to these processes, therefore maybe we'll make resources available to ensure that peace is sustained, providing a better place and space for American and probably other European businesses to operate there. Is that part of the strategy here? Is that part of the thinking that helps make this is the recipe for success, so to speak?
Yes. I mean, there's certain aspects of the DRC deal where there's, projects and interest in having US equity in projects. And then there's also, alongside this agreement, there was DFC engagement in a specific project. And I'll give you a really good example as to why the skin in the game approach does really help. So we used to have DFC used to be called OPIC before the Build Act changed DFC into a new remandated development finance corporation under Trump 45. But a former ambassador to Ukraine told me that when an OPEC investment happened in Ukraine, and there were challenges, whether it was kind of political shifts or commercial challenges, social challenges to the project, community pushback, or something like that. The ambassador was far more empowered to go in and advocate for the project because there's US taxpayer dollars on the line, right? And so
Mhm.
it really allows us to bring far more credible engagement, but also with the potential to say, hey, if this doesn't work, if you're unable to kind of support this project that we have long diligence, that we are trying to maintain, I mean, there's pretty strict standards and guidelines when you get DFC investment in any project, right? So
Mhm.
if we're going to come in with doing it the right way for you guys, we need your support to kind of see it through, and we need you to be government X or community X partners to the US in trying to drive that. And so it does make a big difference to be able to have those stakes involved in engagement rather than just kind of the high level talking points.
And do you agree with the sort of sentiment that I've heard about by having these agreements in place, by having the U.S. government involved, by involving U.S. companies in countries like the Congo or Rwanda, you're making it so that you're raising the bar essentially for how the resource extractions occurring in those countries, and things like human rights and other environmental issues that Western people care a lot about and highlight as being a problem in that part of the world. There's an opportunity to kind of mitigate some of those issues there, or is or is that not really is it's hard to say anything is guaranteed, but are we increasing the likelihood that those problems are going to be addressed with agreements like this?
Yeah, again, I think that like more the actual investments from, our government through DFC, through XM, to the extent XM is the ability to go into certain countries, through USTDA and now the Office of Strategic Capital between the DoD
Mhm.
or DOW. those actually do drive more of that race to the top that you're alluding to. I think the agreements are an important framework, and there's a role, a diplomacy role, a commercial diplomacy role to play in this. But like the real drive of that change comes from kind of the investment and the requirements affiliated with those investments. If we don't engage, then there's one player in town that comes in and buys the offtake of these minerals and invests in these projects. And historically, we've seen that they do not hold to the same standards in these markets, depending on kind of the rules of the road in those countries. And so even just having more investors, more purchasers from the US, from Western governments, helps drive that internal competition for higher standards in these specific projects. I also just want to emphasize, it doesn't mean that there's not a need for capacitization of these governments to keep on top of having the kind of higher standards and monitoring for, fair production. There's other aspects of this that I think also needs to happen through these agreements and through the State Department. And so we're not 100% there just because we have an agreement. Like these are long-term reforms and governance practices that should also be contemplated.
So in that list that I read off, we focused a lot, obviously, just now on Congo and Rwanda and basically Africa more generally. But Australia and Japan are also in that list. Help the audience understand why those are important countries for us to have these bilateral agreements with for critical minerals.
Yes, yeah. I'll start with Australia. Australia is obviously a major producing country. They have a long history of mining. A lot of their GDP is attached to natural resource extraction and development. And right now, a lot of those materials go to the number one buyer for these materials, into China. So it's really important for the US to partner with such a long-term, long-standing security partner to the United States in Australia to be able to work on a core component of their economy, but to help meet our needs around minerals development. My favorite project out of the list of, and the other companies will maybe forgive me for having a favorite, but out of the long list of projects that were included in the US-Australia agreement is the gallium project out of Alcoa. And I really like that project because it includes considerations around refining of that gallium that they'll be producing through their waste for their alumina refining, but also for our downstream industry and offtake to the United States. And the refining, actually, a part of it happens, if not a majority of it happens in Japan. So triangulating that partnership with Japan was really savvy. And then you also have the host government in the Australian government also ponying up support in up to $200 million in equity for that project, in addition to the Department of War support. And so it really is kind of everybody coming together, the buyers, the producers, the implicated governments, the Japanese government's implicated through JOGMEC and SOJITS as well, to be able to risk share in a mineral that's honestly a really, really small market mineral, but outsized importance to our broader economy. So I think that was well done, incredibly beautifully. And I hope the other deals get that same level of holistic attention.
You said equity. The Australian government was taking equity stakes in this agreement. I guess when I think of government, I don't think of them taking equity stakes generally in investments. They usually are doing loans or grants of some sort. I know the Trump administration is doing some amount of equity stakes in some cases, including these critical mineral companies. How common is this in general? Is it more common in critical minerals, or is that something that Australia does often? Help us understand a little bit about the role of government in getting these projects off the ground, if these equity stakes are necessary or if they're just kind of an opportunity because the government knows they can kind of make it a better deal for the taxpayer. Help us walk through that a little bit, if you can.
Yes. So, and I'll admit, I'm a little bit biased because in my last job with the Quebec government, there was an arm of the government called Investissement Québec that takes equity stakes in critical minerals projects and natural resource projects. So I'm as a person just like slightly more comfortable with this concept, I would say, than your average person in kind of the free market economy space. The other thing I would say is like there have been, reports from places like the IMF that have also said that if the government is going to use industrial policy through things like equity stakes, then the most effective way to do it is if you're engaging in the upstream parts of supply chains that have such a disperse effect on our economies where there may be market failures. which, I mean, both those things are true, right? We know minerals are super important to the broader economy, and we know that there are market failures, or I wouldn't be kind of employed doing this work constantly, because there is just a lot of challenges in this space.
Right.
The administration's approach, I think, to this has been to solve for some of the financing gaps in the capital stack right now. There's just not the equity markets for these minerals are maybe not as robust as other sectors. So that's part of it. And so we're pleased to see that intervention there. I think their motive in trying to make sure that the US taxpayers get some of the upside in these projects as they're making these investments definitely reflects a little bit more of a Wall Street mentality. And it'll be interesting to see kind of the legacy impacts of that perspective and whether or not future administrations choose to continue down that path. Also important to monitor, what does the US government do with the financial upsides that they may be gaining from these projects? Does that go somewhere else related to solving these problems? Does that offset some of our debt? Those are questions that have yet to be answered.
Yeah, great questions for them to think about for sure. Let's switch to batteries and EVs here in the US. That's going to be something probably more familiar with our audience too. And connecting these dots to what's going on outside the US around critical minerals and processing and all these agreements and investments. The single largest investment in the clean economy in the last several years was batteries in the battery supply chain. We have well over $100 billion at stake right now to do battery plants, to do other things throughout the battery supply chain. And, we also are experiencing softening demand for electric vehicles. That doesn't necessarily mean we have a softening demand for batteries per se, but it is true that all electric vehicles are going to sell less in the near term. So help us walk through, what does this mean for the critical minerals industry? Is the U.S. change so important that it might have downstream effects to the critical minerals industry, or is it something that the rest of the world is going to keep going on this path, regardless of how the sort of market dynamics are happening here?
I think we've definitely seen some changes following not only the policy changes that are enticing the deployment of EVs in the United States, but just kind of the general sentiment shifting attention away from this area. And that has had cascading effects throughout the supply chain. A lot of minerals companies are anchoring their production around the future demand of electric vehicle deployment, because it's really hard to unwind existing supply chains, convincing other industrial users of minerals to turn to alternative producers of minerals that aren't at scale, at spec, and at cost, right? There's a lot of pushback, consternation we get from procurement teams to just get them to even consider these projects. In the EV space, there was a total shift when there was a carrot at the end of the road, a light at the end of the tunnel that could justify them evaluating these other projects. And it gave a little bit of negotiating power to these secure sources of supply from free trade agreement countries domestically to have that. Those people are still needing EV demand, but without kind of the justification that they engage with those companies with a carrot, right? I think the Trump administration is obviously using a lot of sticks, particularly through tariff policy, and we're anxiously awaiting the recommendations out of the 232 investigation into processed critical minerals and derivatives, which points out specifically batteries, but also cathode and anode materials, and how they're going to hopefully try to consider the broader market dynamics and fundamental challenges to get people to look at these projects again. But yes, it is a very different world now that we have a lack of incentives and we have that softening EV demand. The last thing I'll say is a lot of the battery manufacturers in the US that we talk to and work for are considering changing their passenger vehicle battery lines to energy storage systems and long duration storage lines so that they can kind of meet the demand that is anticipated from the AI boom in the United States.
Yeah, that was, you took my follow-up there. I did want to ask about the likelihood that you see some of these manufacturers pivoting because their investments are at stake, and there might be decreasing demand for batteries in transportation, at least for all electric vehicles, not necessarily for hybrids or plug-in hybrids. But there's clearly a lot of demand for batteries in the power sector. Is that something you could speak to just to help the audience understand what that means? Because, it's certainly on the one hand, you're talking about just putting a battery in a box instead of in a car, but on the other hand, I'm sure there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, and in this energy storage sector, the grid is not my bailiwick. I have a counterpart who covers this like excellently, and so I'll encourage you to maybe have her on your podcast down the line. I think there's two things that I hear constantly from Danielle, our executive director of our Center for Grid Security, and from the industry players, is that the reason batteries are being considered such a priority source of power for these data centers is because there's a real need for near-term firm power to kind of help offset, high surge power moments without adverse effects on the grid. But so from a technical perspective, it's very attractive. And then additionally, I've heard from a couple of these battery companies, and I'm hearing it from them. I'm not hearing it from the gas turbine manufacturers, so we should take it with a grain of salt, but that gas turbine manufacturing is a 6-year kind of lag for us to be able to use those technologies for the data center boom. And there's also this, preference, I think, for data centers to use clean power as well, just to kind of manage their emissions profile. So maybe that's a third piece of this. In terms of how quickly you can shift from, an EV line to an energy storage line, I think it depends on a lot of different technical variables. There is a propensity towards using lithium iron phosphate batteries for long duration storage for energy density needs. There are also other chemistries coming online that have heavier weights, but then again, if you're not moving them, then obviously it makes a lot of sense to use them on the grid, right? And then a lot of the EV lines that we've been working with are today been focused on nickel, manganese, cobalt chemistries and different kind of amounts, depending on kind of the end product. But that shift is something I think we need to kind of keep an eye on, because is there going to be the preference towards LFP manufacturing, which we really, lack at scale in the United States, where China dominates a lot more. And how do we want to kind of manage the security impacts, and I say security impacts, including the economic security impacts of our demand playing into the hand of a already primary producer and market leader.
Yeah. The LFP is an interesting story, just because it's another case where something was invented in the US but scaled elsewhere. I'm wondering if, just to close things out, because we're a little over time here, but I want to leave the audience with a looking forward kind of question from your perspective in critical minerals in the US. What's going to dominate the conversation around critical minerals in the US? For the last several years, it was really about electric vehicles and the opportunity. You just brought up the issue around energy storage and the opportunity there. One thing we haven't talked a lot about, but is clearly a priority for the administration, and you mentioned it earlier at the top, is the defense issues and needs for the US government and such. So help us understand those dynamics a little bit, and how you're seeing this move forward, and where there's going to be the most opportunity in the near term.
So we need many, many minerals on the long 60 mineral list for our defense applications. There's not an incredible amount of substitution. And even if you are substituting, it's probably for another mineral where we have similar supply chain vulnerabilities with. So I would think that when we're kind of talking through the national security impacts, it's really a binary of whether or not you can get it, especially as conflict continues to brew in different parts of the world, and the US government engages in that. And so they're very closely engaging with ways that they can secure supply. Unfortunately, though, defense demand is really in the single digits mostly when it comes to critical minerals, which means that you do want to piggyback off of the commercial demand for all of the mineral needs that we have for, the automotive sector that we've talked about, but also consumer electronics, the hyperscalers, and be able to kind of justify the scaling of economics. Said in a much simpler way, you're not going to build a copper mine to fit our defense needs. That would be astronomically expensive for the US taxpayer, and it doesn't necessarily make sense. And so we do need to see that kind of public-private sector engagement continue. And I do think that the administration is considering that. Even there was a project, Vulcan Re-Element, that was a partnership between both the Department of Commerce using CHIPS Act funding, and then also the Department of War using the Office of Strategic Capital to be able to support a magnet manufacturer and the refining pieces of that supply chain, so that they could do this not only for the magnet needs for the semiconductor industry, but also, the needs within the defense industrial base.
Sounds like some opportunity to do some drafting off, the defense needs of these minerals in the near term. And I'm sure a lot of policy people are thinking about that a lot right now. So Really, really wonderful conversation, Abigail. Grateful for you to join us for our last episode of the year for EV Hub Live. This brings us to a close. 2025 is just about over, everybody. And we really are grateful for this conversation with you, Abigail, at SAFE. And we look forward to seeing everybody again in January. Have a happy holidays.
Thanks so much, Nick. Happy holidays.